When I first moved into my house, it was like the whole neighborhood gave me this big hug. I mean, everybody came up and introduced themselves to me, and some of my neighbors introduced me to other people, the mailman, all kinds of different people. And I even heard about some of the neighbors who I didn't get to meet. Some folks were traveling, and some of the neighbors were just too elderly and just didn't get out that often, so I hadn't got to meet them yet. And, take, for example, the judge. Well, one of my neighbors said he's a retired judge. He's been retired a long time, and he really doesn't get out too much anymore, but there's a nice young man that checks in on him and brings him groceries and makes sure he's doing okay. And, sometimes on a nice spring day you might see him. Well, that piqued my interest, and I wanted to see this judge. So I watched for him, and one fine spring morning, sure enough, I saw an elderly man stepping out of his house, as delicate as paper. His skin so white it was almost blue. And he stepped out, and he walked so gingerly and so carefully. And he went over to this little plot of garden. And he was so kind to the soil. And he touched it, and you could just see this is an old dear friend that he'd come to check in on. And then he slowly worked his way back to the house. Well, I didn't see the judge for quite some time after that, but it got me curious about what exactly it was that the judge was growing. So I watched to see what was coming up. It was big. It was ferny and large and fluffy and strange, and it looked a little wild for a judge. And I was like, what the heck is he growing? And I watched it, and as it got further, I realized, son of a gun, the judge is growing asparagus. Well, when I was a young girl, asparagus was my favorite food. No, I don't say my favorite vegetable. Asparagus was my favorite food. I love asparagus. I still love asparagus. So when I realized that the judge was growing asparagus, one, I suddenly became much more fond of him, and two, I had a burning desire to meet him and perhaps have an asparagus sharing moment with the judge. So I watched for other opportunities. I didn't see the judge again, but I did see that nice young man. And I managed to start a conversation with him. So, I see there's some asparagus growing over there. Is anybody actually feeding it? Oh, said the young man. The judge loves his asparagus. He can't wait. Every spring he watches for his asparagus. He's already planning what his first asparagus meal will be this year. Well, sadly, the judge didn't get to have that asparagus meal that year. He passed away before the asparagus was ripe. Seemed a shame to see all that beautiful asparagus going to waste, but seemed wrong to go and eat a dead man's asparagus, too. The next spring, new folks had moved in, and they had a dog, and I was really worried the dog was going to, poop or dig up the asparagus, and I watched carefully, and, the dog did okay, and the asparagus came up, and I'm not sure that the folks knew what it was, but they didn't mess with it, so at least the asparagus got to come back again. Following year, those folks had moved away. They had bought too big of a house, and they just really couldn't afford to keep it up. For example, at this point, the roof on the judge's house was starting to get kind of beat and really needed new shingles. And so I watched, and new folks moved in, and, it's good that they seemed to be sprucing up the place and doing stuff, and that was good to see, and nobody was messing with the asparagus bed. I watched for that, and this morning I got up and looked out the window, and I saw that, hey, that's great. They're actually getting the roof redone. They were tearing off all those old shingles and putting in new shingles. And then I looked down, and I saw the tarps. There were tarps completely covering the asparagus bed, and shingles piled high on top of that asparagus. And I don't know. Maybe it'll come back. It's hard to tell. It's still early spring. Maybe it'll come back. When I was a young woman, I really, really, really wanted to be a famous artist. I wanted to be well known and respected and even known after my death. I just so desperately wanted to be known and accepted and realized. I'm older now, and on this cool spring day, it's enough for me to know that the judge, he really loved his asparagus.